Right now, somewhere in your city, a funeral is happening. Black clothes. Quiet voices. A hole in the ground. It feels ancient. It feels like it has always been this way. But the real answer is far stranger. For most of human history, death didn't look like this at all. Go back 300,000 years. Your ancestors are walking across a dry landscape in what is now Morocco or Ethiopia. One of them falls. Doesn't get up. The others stand around the body. What happens next is not obvious. It is not instinct. It has to be invented. And here's the strange part. For a very long time, nothing happened at all. Early Homo sapiens, and even earlier hominins like Homo naledi, sometimes just left their dead where they fell. Or dragged them somewhere out of the way. No ceremony. No grave. Just absence. A person who was there yesterday, and simply isn't anymore. Then, somewhere between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, something shifts. At a site called Kafzeh Cave in Israel, archaeologists found a skeleton of a child, buried deliberately, with a deer antler placed carefully across the chest. Not thrown in. Placed. Someone chose that antler. Someone decided it belonged there. Why does that matter? Because placing an object with a body means you believe something about that body. Maybe that the person still needs it. Maybe that they deserve it. Either way, you are no longer just removing a corpse. You are telling a story about what happens next. This is where death stops being a biological event and starts being a human one. Paleoanthropologist Paul Pettit, who has spent decades studying the archaeology of death, argues that burial itself is one of the clearest signs of symbolic thought in the human story. Not tool use. Not fire. Burial. Because burial requires you to imagine a future that the dead person is somehow still part of. Think about what that actually requires, cognitively. You have to hold an idea in your head that isn't true yet. You have to imagine that this stiff, silent body in front of you still matters in some way tomorrow, and the day after, and maybe forever. That is an enormous leap. Animals grieve. Elephants touch the bones of their dead. Chimpanzees sit near a dead group member for hours, sometimes days. But as far as we can tell, no other species buries its dead with intention, over and over, as a pattern. So what did that intention actually look like in practice? At Sunjia, in what is now Russia, archaeologists uncovered a grave from roughly 34,000 years ago containing 2 children, buried head to head, covered in thousands of ivory beads. Thousands. Each bead would have taken real time to carve. Researchers estimate it could have taken over 10,000 hours of labor to produce all the beads in that single burial. 10,000 hours. For 2 children who could not use any of it. That number should stop you for a second. Because it tells you something about value. The community that buried those children wasn't spending resources on the living. They were spending them on the dead. On a story about what the dead deserved. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, Neanderthal remains were found in a way that led early researchers to a controversial idea, that flowers had been placed in the grave. Later analysis complicated that specific claim, largely attributing the pollen to burrowing rodents. But the surrounding evidence at Shanidar still shows something important. One individual, known as Shanidar I, lived for years with severe injuries, missing an arm, likely partially deaf, and clearly survived only because others fed him, protected him, and kept him alive long after he stopped being useful in any practical sense. That's not really a story about death. That's a story about who gets to matter while they're still alive. And it connects directly to burial. If a group is willing to carry an injured man for years, it makes sense that they'd also be willing to mark his absence when he finally died. Here's the twist most people don't expect. Burial wasn't really about the dead at all. It was about the living. Anthropologist Robert Pogue Harrison, in his work on the culture of burial, describes graves as one of the earliest ways humans marked a place as meaningful, as different from the rest of the landscape. A grave says, something happened here. Someone was here. This spot is not like other spots. That single idea, that a place can hold meaning beyond its physical use, is arguably where human culture begins. Before religion had a name. Before anyone had a word for sacred. There was just a hole in the ground, and the decision to dig it exactly here. Different groups did this differently, too. Some buried their dead curled tightly, knees to chest, almost like a sleeping position, or, some researchers suggest, like a return to the posture of the womb. Others painted the bones with red ochre, a pigment made from iron oxide, staining the remains a deep rust color that shows up again and again across burial sites on multiple continents, separated by tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles. Why red? No one knows for certain. But red is the color of blood, of life, of fire. Using it on bones might have been an attempt to put life back into the body, symbolically, even after it was gone. Some cultures didn't bury at all. In parts of the ancient world, and in some traditions that continue today, the dead were left exposed, on platforms or in high places, for birds to take. This is sometimes called excarnation. It sounds unsettling from the outside, but within that worldview, returning a body to birds and sky was itself an act of respect, a way of returning a person to the natural world rather than sealing them away from it. There is no single correct ancient way to handle death. There are dozens. Hundreds, probably, lost to time. What connects almost all of them is the same underlying need, to do something, to mark the moment, to refuse to let a person's absence pass in silence. Psychologists studying grief today describe something similar happening in the brain. Grief isn't just sadness, it's the brain's prediction system breaking down. Your mind has spent years, sometimes decades, building a model of the world that includes this person, their voice, their footsteps, their replies. When they die, that model doesn't update instantly. Part of you keeps expecting them, keeps predicting them, even while another part already knows they're gone. That gap, between what your brain expects and what is actually true, is part of why grief feels so disorienting. You're not just sad. You're recalibrating an entire internal model of reality. Maybe that's why humans invented ritual in the first place. Not to bring the dead back, but to give the living something to do with that gap. A place to dig, a story to tell, a red pigment to apply, a bead to carve, one of 10,000 hours worth, because the alternative, doing nothing, felt unbearable. So when you stand at a funeral today, in black clothes, saying quiet things over a hole in the ground, you are not really performing a modern custom. You are doing something your ancestors were already doing 70,000 years before writing existed, before agriculture, before cities, before almost everything you'd call civilization. The clothes have changed, the words have changed, the pigment is gone, but the impulse underneath it, the refusal to let a person's absence pass without meaning, that part never left. It was never really about death at all. It was always about what the living couldn't bear to leave unsaid.